I had gone there for a job interview. I placed my file on the empty seat next to me, and when my name was called, I quickly got up to grab it. But when I looked at the seat, it was empty. My entire set of documents had disappeared. A wave of panic hit me like a tidal wave. I frantically looked around, and then I saw him, some guy holding my documents, flicking a lighter under them. My vision blurred as though stars had filled my daylight. Sitting on the bed in a red bridal dress, my face turned pale as chalk. I had invited disaster upon myself. I had done it willingly, but now there was no turning back. I wasn't exactly regretting it, but my heart was pounding out of my chest. I felt like throwing myself out of the window, but it was too late. The door to the room creaked open, and he was there. He didn't walk in like a normal person. He barged in, jumped on the bed with his shoes on, and began bouncing. A garland of flowers around his neck swayed wildly, and rose petals fell into my lap. But I knew that my life would be filled only with thorns. Tears streamed down my face, and I began to sob uncontrollably. A sudden pain gripped my chest, and my heart felt as if it might burst. My husband noticed and immediately dropped to his knees in front of me. "What's wrong? Didn't you like my dance?" he asked. "You look like a ghost when you cry. Please stop. You're scaring me." Then he pretended to be scared, burst into a loud, hearty laugh, and I could see the back of his throat. I was filled with intense irritation and disgust. That 30-year-old man was my husband, but he had nothing of a man about him. He was like a crazy child, and I had brought him into my life willingly. Now I would spend the rest of my life bearing his madness and tyranny. He stared at me for a moment before saying, "If you hadn't slapped me, I might have treated you kindly. But every time I look at you, I remember that slap. So now I'll have to be a bit strict." And then, without warning, he started removing my jewelry. I could see the madness in his eyes. I knew what he was about to do because I had read his medical history. He was someone who lost control around women, who went berserk and unleashed his fury. And this time, I was his target. I was prepared for it because I had no choice. Helplessly, I surrendered myself to his madness. I had made a deal when I married him, and now it was time to start paying the installments. I had been told not to utter a word, not to resist. He would do whatever he wanted, and that night I am Amara Tukir. My biggest crime was being a woman. Unaware of the consequences, I was once a lively, smiling girl. I had dreams running through my veins, a desire to conquer the world. I was the eldest daughter, and my younger sister Fenra was 10 years my junior. My father worked as a manager in a private firm, and our family was well off. We were a small, happy household living a peaceful life. My sister and I were showered with love and attention from our parents. After graduating, I dreamed of becoming a successful businesswoman. I had learned so much from my father. He worked at a company whose boss had expanded his business to the U.S. and was the wealthiest businessman in the country. My father was a trusted employee, working as his manager. He often took me to his office because I was deeply interested in business. I had met his boss, Afaq Afandi, a couple of times. He was extremely pleasant, greeting me warmly each time. I was greatly inspired by him and wanted to learn from him. One day I expressed to my father that after completing my master's degree, I wanted to work in his office and learn the art of successful business from him and his boss. My father smiled and said, "Why not? I'm proud of you. You'll go far, and my prayers and support are always with you." From that moment, I began dreaming big. As I approached my second year of master's exams, I was buried in books day and night, determined to achieve a stellar GPA so I could land a job on merit. I was on the cusp of achieving my dreams. All I had to do was reach out and seize them. But just as I was about to grasp it all, the ladder I was standing on was pulled out from under me, and I fell flat on my face. My once cheerful life was about to be thrown into chaos. My destruction was just around the corner. After earning my master's degree, I prepared thoroughly and went with my father to his office for a job interview. While he went to his office after wishing me good luck, I sat in the waiting area with my documents placed on the seat next to me. Many people had gathered there, each hoping for a chance. I felt both excited and nervous. I had confidence in my abilities, but my heart was racing. When my name was called, I jumped up to grab my file, but the seat next to me was empty. My documents were gone. The room spun around me as stars seemed to appear in broad daylight. Panicked, I started searching frantically, but my papers were nowhere to be found. My name was called a second time. I regained my composure and ran toward my father's office, hoping he could help or at least speak to his boss so that I could interview at the end of the session. On the way, I spotted a boy with disheveled hair holding my green file. I sprinted toward him, intent on snatching my documents back and slapping him across the face. As soon as I reached him, my blood was boiling. How had the guards even allowed someone like him inside? In a sudden move, I lunged for the file, but he grabbed me around the waist and pulled me close. In that moment, I felt my patience reach its limit. I slapped him hard across the face. A few passers-by who were busy with their own errands suddenly stopped to watch the commotion. My face turned red with humiliation, and his eyes seemed to fill with rage. "How dare you slap me? Do you have any idea who I am?" he said. I retorted, "I don't need to know who you are because you're just a crazy person." With that, I snatched the file from his hands. But before I could walk away, he grabbed the file again and ripped it in half, then into 4 pieces, and tossed them into the air. I stood there, stunned, my mouth agape. He had destroyed all my hard work in seconds. These were my original documents. Before I could lose my temper completely, my father appeared out of nowhere, visibly shaken, and grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "Let me go, Baba," I said. "I'm going to kill him today. How dare he, this insane, ignorant man, show up here and behave like this?" My father pressed his finger firmly against my lips and said, "Not another word." He was so distraught that I couldn't understand why he was acting this way. Then, to my shock, he stood before the boy and apologized. "I'm sorry," he said. "She doesn't know who you are. Please forgive me." My heart sank. This boy was unbelievably rude. He shoved my father's shoulder, pushing him back against the wall. Then he turned to me, stared directly into my eyes, and said, "I'll remember your face. One day I'll have you, and every night will be a night of ruin for you. No matter the cost, I'll make you mine." I stood there in disbelief, completely speechless. It felt as though all my words had been stripped away. What was going on? Why was my father apologizing to him? He should have slapped that guy instead. Before I could ask who the boy was, my father grabbed my arm again, hurried me into his office, and shut the door firmly. He was so upset that it was unbearable. He took a sip of water, then said, "This is bad, very bad." I asked him, "Baba, why are you talking like this? Who is he, and why are you so afraid of him?" My father replied, "You should be afraid too, because he gave you a warning. When he decides to do something, he'll see it through." I stared at him in shock, my voice trembling. "What do you mean? That nonsense he was spewing out there? Will he really go through with it?" Then, with a mix of bitterness and defiance, I said, "Over my dead body." But I was fooling myself. My downfall had already begun. My father said, "Cover your face with your dupatta properly. I'll take you home." I protested, "Baba, how can you do this? My interview is today." But he said, "Forget about the interview. Just do as I say." The authority in his voice made me fall silent. The situation was far more complicated than I'd realized. Quietly, I obeyed him and followed him out of the company. My heart was pounding. My father was extremely cautious, glancing around constantly. Then he got me into the car and started driving. He kept wiping sweat from his forehead. After a while, when he seemed slightly calmer, I asked, "Baba, please tell me, who is he? Why are you so afraid of him? He was the one at fault." I wanted to teach him a lesson. My father said, "Just be quiet. Pray that we don't get into trouble, because that crazy boy you slapped isn't just anyone. He's my boss's son, my boss's only son, his pride and joy, the one he'd give his life for. That boy is Arsal Effendi." I froze in disbelief. That lunatic, that ignorant fool, is he really the son of such a big businessman? And their only son? I could barely comprehend it. I remembered hearing from Baba that his boss had one son, but I never imagined he would be like that. "So what if he's their son? He's still the one at fault," I insisted. Baba gave me a bitter smile. You don't understand, we're employees, we're powerless. Even if it's not our fault, the blame still falls on us. Just pray that this mistake doesn't lead to something terrible, because he's a reckless, unstable young man. If he misbehaves with any girl, anywhere, even in the office, no one dares stop him, Baba explained. Everyone knows how costly it can be to stand against him. 2 years ago, he harassed his father's secretary right in the office. He pulled off her dupatta and told her she looked better without it. She slapped him in retaliation, even though the boss was watching. His father knew it was his son's fault, but he still fired the secretary on the spot, and that wasn't the end. The next day, that secretary was assaulted at her apartment, and she took her own life. Everyone knew who did it, but not a single person dared to speak up. Baba's voice trembled. This world is full of cruelty. I've tried my best to shield you from it. If I had known Arsal would be at the office today, I never would have left you alone. It's my fault. I don't know what will happen now. Hearing all this left me stunned. How can someone be so heartless? I thought. I had always admired Afak Effendi, but now I felt nothing but intense hatred for a man who could enable his son's cruelty. I don't want to work in a place like this, I said. I won't take a job at an office run by such cruel people. Baba looked at me and said, just pray that Arsal forgets this incident, or it could end very badly. He was still visibly shaken. I tried to reassure him, but the next day when Baba went to the office, he didn't return. I spent the entire day in restless worry, repeatedly calling him, but he didn't pick up. He had told me not to follow him if he was late, but by 9 p.m. I couldn't wait any longer. Just as I was about to leave the house, the police arrived. They started searching everywhere. Mama was startled and asked what was going on. I stood there, trying to make sense of it all. What's the meaning of this? I demanded. What are you looking for in our home? The officer replied, your father is under arrest. He's been accused of a massive embezzlement at the company. It's said that he tricked Afak Effendi into signing over some extremely valuable property documents and stored them in his locker. We're here to find those documents. If we do, your father will face severe punishment. I understood everything now. The prayer Baba had asked me to say, to prevent anything bad from happening, had not been answered. Disaster had already struck. Mama, trembling, cried out, my husband would never do such a thing. They've never embezzled a single rupee in their entire life. What are you even saying? But the police turned the house upside down. Then the inspector emerged from my father's room, waving a file in the air. This is the file, he declared smugly. This will make a strong case. He'll rot in jail for the rest of his life. That scumbag? My blood boiled. I wanted to claw his face off because I knew exactly what had happened. The inspector had just planted that file in my father's locker to find it there. I was certain there had never been any such file. But we were powerless. We had no resources, no connections. Before leaving, they even threatened to evict us. That very night, we were thrown out onto the street. My dreams of soaring high were now grounded, weighed down by broken wings. But I didn't give up. If I had, everything would have slipped through my fingers like sand. I knew exactly what I had to do, how I could get my father released. The next day, I went back to that company, the place I had sworn never to set foot in again. When I entered the boss's office, he was lounging back in his chair, one leg crossed over the other. Seeing him filled me with revulsion. Next to him, his son sat comfortably, feet up on the desk, engrossed in cartoons playing on the large LED screen in front of him. I steadied myself, knocked, and asked for permission to enter. Afak Effendi eyed me from head to toe. With a sardonic smile, he motioned for me to sit down. But I wasn't there to sit. I was there to negotiate, to trade my family's happiness and peace for my own freedom. I boldly sat down across from him, mirroring his posture with one leg crossed over the other. He looked at me, clearly impressed. You're brave, I'll give you that, he said. I like courageous women who keep their emotions in check, even in a crisis. Arsal leaned forward, gazing at me before glancing at his father. See, Baba? Look how I've gone about getting her. Now you have to trust my capabilities. I'm not crazy, am I? He burst out laughing again, loud and obnoxious. Afak Effendi gave him a look of displeasure. Who told you you're crazy, my son? I've never seen anyone as intelligent and cunning as you. Let the world think what it wants. I don't care. I can conquer anyone and bring them to you, even if it's my trusted manager. Their brazen words made my insides churn with anger, but I kept my expression neutral. Before I could even make my offer, it seemed they were already sold on my proposal. Afak Effendi continued, My dear, my son is perfectly fine, except for one small habit that occasionally gets me into trouble. Every other night, Arsal needs to take out his anger and passion on some girl. If he can't find one at home, he comes here to the office. Poor little girls get frightened by his harmless mischief. Some even try to complain, go to social media. But in the end, they're the ones who suffer, because they're foolish enough not to understand our power. Eventually, they come around, just like you have. But the difference between you and those other girls is that my son has taken a liking to you. He wants you in his life at any cost. When I think about it, it's not a bad deal, neither for you nor for me. If you're always available to him, he won't go looking elsewhere. They both laughed loudly as if I were some kind of plaything. Their words shook me to my core, but I sat there appearing strong. He continued, Your father will be released from jail tomorrow. He'll even start working at my company again. But in return, you must give yourself to my son, completely and permanently. Whatever he does with you, you won't resist. Do you accept this deal? He asked, staring straight into my eyes. I licked my dry lips, took a deep breath, and said, I accept. I'm willing to sacrifice everything for my father and my family, I said firmly. Then got up and left the office. I knew I was leaving behind something far more precious than I had entered with. The price was too high, but I had no other choice to save my father. That night I lay awake, writhing in pain and anguish. Sleep evaded me completely, while he slept soundly by my side. I was so powerless that I couldn't even show my hatred for him. As dawn broke, I stood under the shower, tears streaming down my face, quietly reliving the nightmare. After praying, I begged for strength and patience because I knew I would need immense resilience to endure the coming days with Arsal. My spirit had been drained in just one night, but I still forced myself to rise. The morning light was spreading. I went downstairs to the lounge. The grand, opulent space felt eerily silent and somber. It reminded me of our small family lounge back home, where my sister and I used to laugh and play. Mama would call out to us from the kitchen, sometimes scolding us, while Baba would gently chide her, saying, Kutsia Begum, don't scold my daughters. Mama would reply, You spoil them too much. If a tough time ever comes, they won't have the strength to face it. The thought of Mama made me nostalgic, and the memory of Baba's condition filled me with anxiety. According to Afak Effendi, he had been released from jail last night, but I had already arrived here before he could return home. My marriage to Arsal had been a simple, swift ceremony, and my mother and sister had tearfully bid me farewell. I, however, had not shed a single tear. I didn't want to make them feel any weaker. I desperately wanted to know how Baba was doing, but I didn't even have my phone. In the kitchen, a maid was probably busy preparing breakfast, and the clinking sounds interrupted my thoughts. Suddenly, Afak Effendi emerged from his room wearing a tracksuit, likely heading out for a jog. Seeing me alive and standing there, he smirked sarcastically. Surely you had a wonderful time with my son, he sneered. He's been crazy about marrying you. He shamelessly hinted at the previous night, but I tightly wrapped my dupatta around my neck, trying to maintain at least some dignity in his presence. He knew his son well. He knew exactly what had happened. As he turned to leave, I asked, Can I talk to my father? Of course, he said. You can even see him. I've been informed that he's in the hospital. He had a heart attack last night. But your situation is different from those other girls. My son truly wants you. He wants to have you at any cost, and that's not a bad deal for either of us. If you're there for him, he'll have no reason to look elsewhere. Hearing that, I could barely breathe. My father, whose life I had risked everything for, was now fighting for his life. It shook me to the core. Tears stung my eyes, but no one was there to wipe them away. Perhaps the endless suffering I feared had finally begun. When I arrived at the hospital, I saw Mama clinging to Finza, sobbing uncontrollably. As soon as she saw me, she collapsed onto me, inconsolable. Then as I turned, I froze. A stretcher was being wheeled in, carrying a body wrapped in a white shroud. It was my father. I stood there stunned. He couldn't bear the sorrow of his beloved daughter, and now he was gone, leaving us to face this merciless world. In that moment, I felt as though I died alongside him. All that remained was a hollow shell, a shattered frame, barely breathing. Everything changed after that, because I had changed. I had gambled my own life for his, but he was gone. So I decided that the only way forward was to take back everything Afak Effendi had used to wield his power. I would make his precious son suffer so deeply that Afak would beg for death. I knew exactly what I had to do. The sharp click of my black heels against the marble floor echoed like a somber melody. I removed my dark glasses and took a long, deliberate look around. This was the same company I'd entered 2 years ago as a hopeful interviewee, but today I entered as a director. People bowed their heads, greeting me with respect, and I returned their nods with confidence. Stepping into the office, I recalled those haunting moments when I had walked into that room to strike a deal with Afak and his son, offering myself in exchange for my father's life. But when my father didn't survive, my purpose had shifted entirely. I no longer sought survival. I sought domination. I wanted to rule over the father and son who once thought they owned me, to have them at my beck and call. I knew it wouldn't be easy. Achieving this position was no small feat, but I understood one thing. The fastest way to gain control is through love and attention. In the beginning, Arsal treated me with pure cruelty. His behavior was inhuman, driven by that slap I'd given him. But over time, I quietly endured his mistreatment, carefully observing his temperament. I began to understand how to handle someone as stubborn as him. Afak Effendi, for all his wealth, never gave his son the attention or care he needed. While he had placed the world's riches at Arsal's feet, what Arsal really craved was affection and connection. Once I grasped this, everything fell into place. I had suffered immensely in my life, but I realized that my chance for revenge lay in that very suffering. Slowly, I lured Arsal into a web of love so intoxicating that he couldn't think of anyone else. Little by little, I turned his mind against his father. I even bribed the doctor who treated Afak. The expensive gifts Arsal showered on me were sold off, funding my plan. The doctor told Arsal that his father was deliberately preventing him from getting better. When he asked why, I already had my explanation ready. I had set someone up to lure Afak Effendi into a compromising position. With a few carefully staged photos and a fabricated story from a woman who claimed to be pregnant with his child and also claimed to be his wife, it wasn't hard to convince Arsal. The carefully orchestrated accusations, coupled with the staged images, led him to believe that his father was trying to disown him. Arsal, who had always been a thorn in his father's side, now saw himself as utterly abandoned. Arsal was devastated. He trusted me completely because in the 2 years we'd been together, I'd given him the love and attention he'd never received from his father. Afak, for all his power and influence, had never taken the time to understand his son's wants or needs. While he could destroy the life of a mere mortal to satisfy his son's whims, he couldn't spend a few minutes sitting with him to ask what he truly wanted. Afak had been consumed by the expansion of his empire, leaving a void that I was more than happy to fill. Gradually, Arsal turned against his father. He became my pawn, doing whatever I suggested. First, I had the company transferred to Arsal's name, then manipulated him into signing it over to me. By the time Afak realized what had happened, it was too late. He had no claim left in the company's Pakistani branch. When he tried to take legal action, I had Arsal face him, a puppet defending his master's actions. I merely watched in silence, savoring the spectacle of father and son locked in a bitter war. The betrayal took such a toll on Afak that he left Pakistan. Soon after, we learned he had suffered a stroke and was also battling heart problems. While Arsal was troubled by the news, I was quietly overjoyed. I wanted him to be rendered powerless, unable to rise again. His suffering was my triumph. Arsal eventually brought his father back to Pakistan. By then, Afak was confined to a bed, his face partially paralyzed. Abroad, his managers had embezzled from him, leaving him with nothing. His condition was worse than death, and every time I saw him like that, I felt a grim satisfaction, haunted by the memory of my own father's lifeless face. Over time, Arsal grew more serious, shedding his childish behavior. He became my puppet, harmless and expendable. He followed my every lead, and in that sense, my vengeance was complete. Yet as I sat in that office, legs crossed, reflecting on my past, I realized that the pain and anguish I had suffered had transformed me into something I never wanted to be. The tyrants who had once hurt me were now suffering, yet I felt no real joy. I didn't want to become this cold, calculating person, but I couldn't let their cruelty go unchecked. I often visited my mother and sister, who had aged prematurely from all they'd endured. Now I had to be their support. When I stayed away from Arsal for a few days, his madness began to resurface. But by that point, I felt neither pity nor hatred toward him. My revenge was complete. I wasn't sure if I would stay with him forever, or if I'd eventually decide to leave him and end his life in the process. What I did know was that he had destroyed any ability I might have had to trust another man, to feel love again. My emotions were frozen, and perhaps I had become accustomed to this twisted reality. But no, I had never loved him, not once.